Welcome to the Sci Fi Show, where we talk science and philosophy with two of my favourite atheist thinkers, Alex Malpass and Dan Linford. And we're going to do something a bit different today, and that is react to some of our comments on topics from biblical genocide to fine-tuning to meta-ethics that we've done in previous shows. But it's been a while, guys. How have you been? Alex, what have you been up to?
I've been good, thanks. I'm like rebooting my YouTube channel, Thoughtology. So
excellent.
I've been streaming and going into I did a series on presuppositionalism, a deep dive, like 7-hour long, reacting to this guy Eli Ayala's video. So that's fun, and I'm now starting to do another equally pedantic, sort of over the top deep dive on a blog post by Richard Carrier on the ontology of logic. And it's a really good excuse to sort of dig out some old sort of logic textbooks and stuff, and go into some of these arguments about Aristotle and the principle of non-contradiction and stuff. So if you're interested in that, head on over to my channel after this. You can see the first part of that, and I'll stream the next bit, I don't know, some other time next week maybe.
Brilliant. Dan, what about you? Been ages, mate. What have you been up to?
I've been preparing classes. I've been doing research. So I've been busy this summer, but things are coming together.
Yeah. It's good for us to get the band back together again. I've been on the road promoting the book, Battle of the Big Bang, and we've got the Royal Institute and Alex O'Connor show. That's all happening, I think, this week, so look out for that. But let's get back to the Sci-Fi Show. We're going to start with a comment from our first ever show, where we reviewed William Lane Craig's appearance on Alex O'Connor's show Within Reason. And here Craig defended the slaughter of the Amalekites, where God commanded the massacre of men, women, children, even animals. And this led to a comment from Joel Moten, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, 9365. And he said, quote, "What Craig says about the Canaanite children makes him a sociopath." So does it? What do we think? Alex, why don't you kick us off?
Well, I'm a bit hesitant in like using that word because it's a sort of technical psychology kind of word. It denotes a specific condition. I don't know. I'm not qualified to diagnose that in particular. So if we set aside the kind of medical definition there, which I don't want to go anywhere near, I do think in the kind of common vernacular, there is something like shocking about the defense of that. And it's similar to the types of things we hear with people justifying Israeli military action in Gaza these days. It's increasingly seeming sociopathic in the same way. It's sort of indefensible, horrific violence. And I mean, there is some similarities between the two of the things. I wouldn't want to speculate really on any connection between them, but it's distasteful to the point where I feel very uncomfortable with people making those sorts of arguments. So it sort of goes beyond the kind of like gentle fencing philosophy thing where it's like, I make this point and I rebut it thusly kind of towards being just like, what the fuck are you chatting about? Like, no. Right. So I have that visceral reaction to it. Yeah.
Right. It is a bit different to just saying like, oh, I think the solution to the Sleeping Beauty paradox is this. No, it's this, Yeah, it is a little bit different. Dan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, right. So like Alex, I don't think, none of us here have the professional qualifications for diagnosing psychopathy. So I want to stay way away from anything like the psychiatric conception of the term. I'd prefer for this reason not to use the term sociopathy at all. But I agree with that. But I think it's really shocking to hear someone defend the killing of massive numbers of people. I think that in ordinary discourse, we wouldn't give someone a pass for that. And I don't know why it is that people are so comfortable making that kind of claim when it comes to the Bible. It seems to me that a much better position would be to say that the story just isn't true somehow. There are theologians, of course, who have developed the position that stories like this don't represent legitimate history. If that's if that's right, I think that's a position that's superior to Craig's, because it's a position that doesn't force the Christian into defending genocide.
But on the other hand, like, I mean, let's suppose the story is made up, and probably is, right? But they probably did stuff like that, even if that story is made up, right? Like, back in those days, tribes would fight each other to the death all the time. So, like, if it's a Bronze Age peoples, they probably were doing that type of stuff. So it's typical, isn't it, of the day? It's not like it wouldn't be surprising if that happened, even if the story's made up. I mean, so in a way, the sort of historicity of the story is sort of beside the point. Some stuff like that probably did happen, but like saying anything else about it apart from its sort of primitive, backwards, like messed up struggle for whatever back in the day, like you have to just say that the people were messed up in those days. We know better now. Any other position from that just seems to me like that's what's fucked up about it, basically.
Right, but the historical claims that that more liberal or progressive theologians often reject is the idea that this was something that, if it happened, was commanded by God.
Yeah.
That's the point that like leads Craig into defending the morality of the Canaanite genocide, which is that he thinks that God could command something like that, and he thinks that on the basis of the Bible. Now, it could very well be that there's an ancient people group that has some imperfect understanding of God and independently commits a genocide. Like, if Craig defended that view, that seems like you put him in a better position to me. But if he's going to defend the morality of a genocide on the basis that it was commanded by God, that seems far less plausible.
So, like, I think, sorry, let me just, whilst this is in my head, just, I mean, one way you can look at this is that any Abrahamic religion would, because they share in common at least the story of Abraham, they have to somehow reconcile themselves to the fact that God says to Abraham, you need to go and kill your eldest son, right? Which is just like clearly not cool, not a cool thing to do. And like, what the fuck is going on with that command, right? Like, if Abraham didn't believe, this is Kierkegaard, right? But like, if Abraham doesn't believe what God is saying, then he's not being very pious. If he thinks, well, he's gonna, he's basically lying to me and he's gonna change his mind at the last minute, then he wouldn't really be sort of passing the test that's supposed to be there, this kind of faith test. So he must have believed that he actually is going to go and kill his son, and he's happy to go along and do it. And that's kind of in a nutshell what's going on with this genocide of the Canaanites, because it's just like, could God tell you to do something? Or if God tells somebody to do something that otherwise would be completely unacceptable, is there some way that we can sort of like say that it's okay because God said to do it? Right? So it's like the Canaanite thing is just like the story of Abraham, but with like on a whole people on people scale. But really, it's the same story. And so, well, it's the same. The thing that's shocking about the two stories is basically the same kernel of like, why would a God tell you to do something like that? Right? That just seems completely out of the realms of what a perfect being should be. Even just a normal being, like a quite good being, probably wouldn't tell you to do that, right? So I think once you have to swallow that pill, then your boundaries have been broken down, like a cult leader who's like got you to like accept that their word is always right or something, and then all of a sudden you're having sex with him and like you're thinking, well, I didn't want this to happen. How did this happen? Like, when it's a bit like that, where it's just sort of like made you think wrong, turned your perspective upside down, and if you're justifying the Abraham thing, it's not that far away to start justifying the Canaanite stuff. So I think you have to reject all of this stuff, right? It's at best myth.
Well, one thing I want to just add is that I don't care whether the events happened or not. I doubt they did. The point is the moral that's embedded in the story. Like, there's a narrative, and as part of the narrative, that action is clearly seen as righteous. So what I object to is the perception by the storyteller of the righteous action of the God character in the story. Obviously, I don't believe God commanded this. I don't believe in God at all. It doesn't matter. The point the point is what's embedded in the story. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the way that historicity matters is as a sort of internal issue for Christian theology, right? So the internal issue is something like this: when presented with a story like this, should the Christian think that God would issue a command of that kind? If they think it's legitimate history, then their hands are already tied, and then they think that God would issue a command like that. If they're willing to say, no, actually, we can see the light of reason or my moral intuition or whatever that God wouldn't behave that way, then that gives a reason for rejecting the historicity of the story, and then they can say, no, God would behave in some other way that we can determine through moral intuition or something like that, right? But that would be a kind of move that is sort of inconsistent with the kind of conservative Christianity that many apologists, at least nowadays, take up, and that I think is sort of the crux of the problem, right? Is that by a morally counterintuitive conception of God and God's actions, they've already tied their hands behind their back.
And one other point is that you might look at the slaughter of the Amalekites and say that didn't happen. That's not sort of foundational story as part of the faith, in my opinion. But the story that Alex just mentioned about the sacrifice that Abraham makes or attempts to make, or the Exodus, these are much more foundational stories, and they have the same slaughter of the innocents. So even if the slaughter of the Amalekites didn't happen, these stories, I think they're going to be much harder to sort of say, that was erroneously included in the canon.
There have been theologically liberal or progressive theologians that reject all of those stories. And so, one of the important questions here is like, how much are Christians willing to give up? Now, conservatives my
God has struck him down.
God strike your phone down.
And again.
And he keeps going.
But conservatives like Craig, of course, are not willing to give up those kinds of stories. And I think it's important to point out that many of the apologists that we interact with, both on our show and on the internet more generally, are conservative enough that they're not going to want to say that a bunch of those stories are not legitimate history. If you look back at the history of Christian theology, there have been plenty of folks who have taken up that position that these are ancient myths, and so we shouldn't think that God would actually behave this way. I was recently talking to a friend of mine who's a Christian but has a more liberal position with respect to the interpretation of the Bible, and his view is that the Bible is inspired by God, but what God did in inspiring the Bible is that God presented a series of stories that are not meant to be taken as true, but are meant to be taken for consideration. Right? So you can imagine an author who presents a bunch of different things, and then it's up to the reader to sort of figure out which parts of it to take as true and which parts not to take as true, and what the actual meaning is in those stories. If you have a position like that, then it's open to you to say, hey, actually, maybe what we should take from these stories is that this is precisely the way that God wouldn't behave.
If you think about it, it's like a scale or something where, on this side, you've got the ultra-conservative, almost literalist readings of everything. It's all historical. Moses was real, whatever. Abraham's real. Isaac was real. It's all real. And then you've got your kind of, Church of England. Well, you can read it however you want. Maybe it's all myth kind of thing. The atheist Christian vicar or whatever on that side. But there's something about in between those. I feel like the positions are sort of it's almost like there's gravitational attraction for those two poles. If you want to sit halfway between them, it's really difficult to start saying, well, yeah, there's some some of it's historical, but not all of it. Because how do you make that determination? How do you say, well, your story of Abraham is basically myth, but the story of Jesus is all historical or something? I think that the middle ground is intrinsically unstable, difficult to keep all the plates spinning at the same time. So I think there's this kind of problem. You don't want to just be sucked onto each extreme, but sitting in the middle that I think is really difficult to maintain.
I think that's right.
Yeah. All right. So let's move on to our next comment. And this is going to be a reply to a clip. So they put in the comment, at 53 minutes. So I'm going to play that clip they're responding to, and then I'll give the comment. So let's hit the clip.
There are lots of actions then that God can perform that would be prohibited morally to us. For example, you wouldn't have the moral right to kill me. But if God wants to strike me dead right now, that's his prerogative. God takes and gives life as he wills. So if God wills to end the life of the Canaanite children prematurely, that's his prerogative.
So the comment is from Fanghurl1123, and he says, Craig is literally admitting to being a moral relativist here. So what do we think, guys? Is this moral relativism? Dan, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, so I don't think so. I mean, on the one hand, I don't think that this position is that the position that Craig is taking up here is all that well motivated. But more generally, we can ask this kind of question: can you have a moral duty that, in virtue of maybe we could say the position or context with which you find yourself, that other people wouldn't have because they exist in other positions or other contexts? I think that that's that is not inconsistent with moral objectivity to think that might be so. So, for instance, you might think that a boss shouldn't have a romantic relationship with their subordinate, and that's a duty that they have, an obligation they have not to have a relationship of that kind in virtue of the position they have. That is, in virtue of their being an employer. Other people who are not that subordinate's employer, for example, wouldn't have that same obligation. So likewise, we could imagine that our obligations that God would have, either to do something or not to do something, or that God might be free of an obligation, for instance, that God wouldn't have the obligation not to kill, in virtue of being God, of being in that position. I think that's a perfectly sensible position. It's a perfectly sensible point of view that's not incompatible with moral objectivity, and it doesn't entail moral relativism.
Alex, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Dan just said then. So, like, a judge has the authority to put you in prison, but, your mate down the road, if he tries to keep you in his cellar, it's not cool. He's not allowed to do that. So all of that, I think, it's not just, well, what's true, what's morally bad is true for me, but it might be false for you or something. It's not that. The idea would be that framework according to which the judge is allowed to send you to prison, but your mate down the road isn't, is objective, and it's true for everybody. So my objection to that wouldn't be that it's moral relativism. It would just be that, like, I don't understand why God has that role, right? Like, Craig seems to think that God could just go around killing anyone he wants to, and that would be fine. But I don't understand where that comes from. Like, how come? Right? If like, a judge might be able to put you in prison, but it just can't do anything that they want to you. There are boundaries, and I guess I would just be like, I'm confused as to why God has, like, complete carte blanche to do anything he wants. And so typically the explanation is something like, well, he made you so he can do what he likes. But that doesn't seem very good, because, if you have a kid, it doesn't mean you can do anything you want to them. Right? You actually have responsibilities towards them, obligations and stuff if you have a kid. So the simple fact of, we just made them so he can do what he likes doesn't seem right. Or just, he made the universe so he can kill you. That just doesn't follow. It's a non sequitur. So, like, I'm just not seeing where the authority for him to be able to just randomly kill people comes from. And then when you add in, he's supposed to be perfectly good, it feels like, well, actually, he might have, like, lots of special powers and stuff like that, but he's also restricted much more than, I mean, like, the judge is allowed to put you in prison, but only if certain very strict conditions obtain, right? He's, like, actually quite constrained in what he's allowed to do. And God seems to me it would be like an extreme version of that, where, it would be only if, I don't know, I can't really, like, give these conditions, but, like, you can imagine it would be something like, if you're a right bastard, then he can like sort of pull you up on it for being like that. But he can't just like on his whim, just like hurl a thunderbolt and kill William Lane Craig for no reason. And it doesn't. I don't think that that's what God has the ability to do. At least all of that stuff sounds like it. That's the thing that needs explaining. It's not just simply the case that it's moral relativism. It's like, okay, if you think that he's got this position of authority, how come? Explain that. Like, where did that come from? So that's my problem, I think, with it.
Right. Dan, I mean, if God is perfectly good, can he command the slaughter of William Lane Craig? Should he command the slaughter of the Amalekites? Isn't it like, well, it must be good because he's good?
Yeah, well, usually, so the position that Craig has on moral obligation is that he makes a distinction between different kinds of things. So we might call axiological properties on the one hand, like goodness and badness. And on the other hand, there are we might think of as deontic properties. Deontic properties are those correspond to the obligations or duties that you have. Now, the axiological properties, goodness and badness, or goodness and evil, Craig thinks that those we can make sense of in terms of God's nature. Somehow, God's nature is the standard for goodness. It's not actually ever really quite clear what that's supposed to mean, but that's part of the view. And then the obligations or duties that people have, we're supposed to make sense of those in terms of the commands that God issues. So, for example, it could be that slaughtering the Canaanites is a bad state of affairs, but it's not wrong to do unless God commands people not to do it. Now we can ask this: could God command something that was out of accord with his nature? The usual sort of idea here is supposed to be that what explains the commands that God issues just is his nature. And so God commands us to do things that result in good states of affairs. And God commands us not to do things that result in bad states of affairs. So if it's really the case that committing a genocide, like against the Canaanites or the Amalekites, is a bad state of affairs, then it's precisely the kind of thing that God couldn't command you to do. That seems to be what follows from Craig's own meta-ethical theory, right? That's not the kind of command that God could give.
Right. So then what about the fact that he did give it? I mean, if you're, as Craig thinks that he did.
Right. So you'd have to give it. So in order to explain that, there's a few moves he could make, which I think we've already sort of articulated. One is that you could reject the idea that God has actually given that command. And
but Craig doesn't do that. He's like, he did.
Craig's move, that's one possible move, however. Another possible to say that, when we make this moral intuitive judgment that is a bad state of affairs, we are making a mistake. And that, in fact, it is a good state of affairs. And we can see that it's a good state of affairs because God has commanded it. It seems like those are the ways you can get out of like having a contradiction in the view. I don't think that Craig picks up the position that's going to be most plausible for the Christian, right? He's biting too many bullets here, I think. And that he should take a position that is more progressive than the one he's willing to take up.
Right. Let me just sort of go back to this issue about moral relativism. I guess maybe what the commentator was hinting at was a problem for, when Craig presents an argument for moral objectivity, he often says, well, you know that torturing a child for fun is wrong. Could the commentator sort of make the argument, well, don't you know that the command of the slaughter of the Amalekites is wrong? Or even like the as you mentioned, the sacrifice that Abraham attempted to make of Isaac. I mean, literally, a mock execution is torture under UN sort of guidance. Could they make the case that, there's this inconsistency there? Like, if you're relying on your moral intuition there, you should rely on it here. And there's an inconsistency. Is that something they could run? Alex, go on, Dan, sorry.
Oh, well, I mean, Alex probably said the same thing here, but I was going to say that we think of intuitions as defeasible. So if you have the intuition, this is a bad state of affairs, but then you come up with new evidence to the contrary, then you you can revise your perspective, right? I think Craig's position with respect to the moral intuition, at least one he ought to have, is that there is, like, prima facie, there's a case for the objectivity of various moral claims, and then in light of evidence we can revise what we think about those claims. But as long as there's at least one putative moral fact for which we have a strong intuition and no defeating evidence, then we have a case for moral objectivity.
Right. Alex, any last thoughts before we move on to the next one?
So I mean, I think that the main sort of key point with this is that if you think to yourself like, oh, I've got this idea that it's wrong to, well, like murder people or something. Like, I mean, cool, good for you. First thing, good. I'm glad you have that. That's good. But you know, let's change the topic a little bit. Like, imagine I also think it's wrong to kind of imprison people as well. But that doesn't mean that I think that like in a just court of law with a judge of the peace weighing everybody in society's interests together or something that it's always wrong to imprison someone. I just think that like I have an intuition, but then sometimes I'm looking at a situation and I go, okay, that guy in this situation with that evidence and this suffering and blah blah blah, yeah, okay, that's not wrong if he's going to prison for this much time, whatever, it seems reasonable or whatever. So like just because you have an intuition and then you see some evidence against it, you don't get to go, oh, it must be relativism then. Like, that's way too quick. Like, morality is super complicated, right? Like, there's this this quote by G.E. Moore, which is, because Moore's like a sort of rationalist about morality. And so I think it may be a conversation with Russell, but yeah, Moore's supposed to have said something like, morality is just like mathematics, but much harder. Right? It's like, it's really messy. It's really difficult to get your head around it and stuff. You don't just get to go, I've got this intuition, the game over. It must be this thing. That's your starting point. And then there's all the other boring minutiae and like weighing the policies up against the consequences and seeing blah, 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 blah. That's how you have to, as a person, even if you're religious and you think you have a book that tells you stuff, you still have to think about the detail and this precise implication of it over here kind of thing. So I think basically the question was just too quick to go to, it must be relativism then that he's advocating for. All the options are still on the table, it seems to me.
All right. So let's move on to the next one. This is still on that same show, that first one we did with about Alex O'Connor and William Lane Craig. And here's a quote from, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right, Chow Matthias 4194, and they said, the difference between being skeptical about the teleology of fine-tuning and being skeptical about the problem of suffering is that the second case doesn't involve some crazy scientific anti-realism, according to which, for some reason, all our best founded theories will prove themselves false. And he gives a little note here that quantum field theory is confirmed with an accuracy of 10 to the 1 to over 10 to the 13 for electron spin, while general relativity is confirmed with similar accuracy for gravitational lensing. So I think the context for this quote is, we were sort of complaining about, we've got the argument from suffering that we advance, and then we're skeptical about the fine-tuning argument that the theists advance. So I think they're calling that into question. Dan, why don't you kick us off on this one?
Yeah. Right. So I think there's two different issues going on here. One is about our confidence that our best scientific theories are true in every detail. And the other is an issue about what exactly we mean about when we say that something is fine-tuned, because it turns out that in different contexts will mean different things by the phrase fine-tuning. So starting with the confidence that we have in our scientific theories, well, the most sophisticated form of scientific realism is what's called selective realism, which is a family of views that holds that we should be realists about some, but not all aspects of our best scientific theories. Now, that sounds a bit vague, and it is, but what people should keep in mind is that there are particular versions of selective scientific realism. And each of those specific versions of selective scientific realism have criteria, really precise criteria for picking out what it is about any given scientific theory that we should be committed to as realists, and then also the portion that we shouldn't be so committed. Now, the situation that we are in with respect to our best theories in particle physics, so for respect to the standard model of particle physics, is a situation that's unprecedented in the history of science, because it's a situation in which there are reasons internal to the standard model itself for being a selective realist. So here's a quote from something I've been working on writing. So I say, our best theory of matter energy is quantum field theory. However, there are additional reasons unique to quantum field theory for being selective realists. Our best quantum field theories, including the standard model of particle physics, do not have an exact formulation. If we try to provide an exact formulation by including what the theory says on every length scale, then various parameters within the theory diverge, that is, they become infinite, and we can no longer make predictions. To prevent that divergence, a cutoff needs to be included that excludes features that the theory would have predicted below a characteristic length scale, so features that are very small, or equivalently above a characteristic energy scale. In turn, the cutoff represents our ignorance. We lump our ignorance together into the cutoff, and thereby the domain of application of our best theories is included within the theory itself. So as Anthony Z puts the point in what is a very standard introduction to quantum field theory at the graduate level, he puts the point this way. He says that theories in physics have the ability to announce their own eventual failure and their domains of validity. And so for this reason, the standard model of particle physics is said to predict its own demise. Now, as I said, Anthony Z's book, it's a book called Quantum Field Theory in a Nutshell. It's published by Princeton University Press. It's a bog standard introduction to quantum field theory for graduate students. So this isn't some fringe position. This is the standard position among physicists that's taught at the graduate level. So as I was saying, we have good reason to be realists only about features larger than the cutoff length scale, or equivalently that are less energetic than the cutoff energy scale, and that don't vary with the cutoff. We should expect different physics perhaps provided by future quantum gravity theory that we don't yet possess, at higher energy scales. There's a paper on this point that brings together the literature on selective realism with the literature on quantum field theory by Williams from 2019 called Scientific Realism Made Effective from the British Journal for Philosophy of Science. Viewers can look to that paper to see that point in more detail. So the point here is just that we shouldn't be realists with respect to every single feature that our best scientific theories give us, and we should be realists only about those aspects of those theories that satisfy these criteria that I've been talking about. Now, in fact, this is actually closely related to fine-tuning. So one way to talk about fine-tuning, the way that's typically talked about in the philosophy of religion literature, is as a datum, right? Something we discover about the natural world. People claim that we discovered that the natural world is sort of teetering on on a razor's edge between two possibilities that wouldn't allow for the existence of life, and it's only when it's on that exact razor's edge that we get the possibility of life. Well, there's another way of talking about fine-tuning, a way that appears in the physics literature, a way that's related to this notion of the natural value of a parameter. So we say that a parameter is fine-tuned in this sense when it has an improbable or unnatural value according to some theory, right? So it's not a theory-independent way of talking about fine-tuning. It depends upon your theory whether the parameter is fine-tuned. And then whether or not a theory is fine-tuned, it depends upon whether or not it includes a parameter like that. Now, in itself, that has nothing to do with the existence of life or the supposed fine-tuning for life. But it turns out that parameters that are supposedly fine-tuned for life are often precisely those that, in our best theories, have improbable or unnatural values. Right? So it turns out that the one version of fine-tuning, even though in principle independent of the other, has implications for the other. There are two places viewers can go to see that point in more detail. One is so if you look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, if you look at the article from 2023 on fine-tuning. It's just titled fine-tuning. If you look at section 5 of that article, it covers this exact point. There's another article by Donahue from 2007 called The Fine-Tuning Problems of Particle Physics and Anthropic Mechanisms. It's an anthology put together by Bernard Carr in 2007 called University of Multiverse, published by Cambridge University Press. Here's like an explicit example of what I'm talking about. The cosmological constant, often thought of as being the best case for fine-tuning, it differs from the predicted value by 10 to the 120 orders of magnitude, something like that. It turns out that it's supposedly fine-tuned for life because of the cosmological constant was much larger than the measured value. Then galaxies would expand apart too fast for life to have ever formed, or for any complex structures to have formed in the universe. If the cosmological constant is too low and negative, then what happens? The universe implodes before you get the formation of complex structure, including life. But notice that it's the value that we observe is incorrectly predicted by quantum field theory, or at least by the theory that the cosmological constant represents the vacuum energy. Now, when a theory so poorly predicts the value of a parameter, I think that what we should do is think that the theory itself is incorrect, not that we've discovered something about the world. So what we need is a new theory on which the value of the cosmological constant is not improbable or unnatural or whatever. In other words, we need a theory that actually successfully predicts the value of the cosmological constant. So when we have a fine-tuned theory, we want to replace that theory by a theory that's not fine-tuned. Now, that's not game over for the theist, because the theist can play this game too. The theist can say, oh, look, I have a theistic hypothesis, a hypothesis that explicitly references God, and which resolves this fine-tuning problem, because this theistic hypothesis is either less fine-tuned or not fine-tuned at all. And then, if in the presence of a hypothesis like that, we'd be making progress if we adopted that kind of hypothesis. The trouble, of course, is that no one's been able to develop a theistic hypothesis that's suitably non-fine-tuned, or at least they haven't shown that that's the case. In the absence of having done so, then they haven't actually removed the problem. They haven't shown that we can get rid of that kind of fine-tuning. So that's the objection that I would put to the fine-tuning argument.
Right. Okay, Alex, what are your thoughts on this comment that we're being sort of inconsistent because fine-tuning is established by physics and we'd have to be anti-realists about that, unlike the suffering, which doesn't require this sort of anti-realism?
Well, so I think that so the idea of the objection, it seems to me, was that, like, for you to be skeptical about the applicability of the results from physics in terms of, like, how unlikely is it that the force of gravity could be different or something, that we're like saying, well, you can't really trust those numbers because maybe there'll be some other physics that will come along, and the idea is that it's like a radical revisionism about physics or something. But I think that there are different ideas about how theory change in physics could be considered. And, on the one hand, you've got this intuition that, like, the physics is really well justified and grounded, and look at the big number that I can come up with for electron spin, whatever. Big number makes you feel confident about it, of course. On the other hand, if you look at all of the other previous scientific theories, like, I don't know, Newtonian physics, we no longer think that's right. And then it's called the pessimistic meta-induction, where you start thinking, well, all the other physical theories we've had in the past have been wrong. What are the chances of this one is the last word on that? And that seems quite intuitive as well. So you're thinking to yourself, well, in like 1 million years or something, if we keep doing science, probably we'll have progressed beyond the point that we're currently at now when we think about quantum field theory and stuff. That'll probably sound really juvenile and whatnot. So we will have rejected it. So there's these two intuitions going at the same time. And the challenge for philosophy of scientific theory changes, like how do you chart a course somehow between these two? So like one view is it's kind of like to appeal to structuralism. There's something stays the same throughout the theory change, but it's a structure, it's some abstract kind of account of it. And many people much better, both of you, I think, would be much better at explaining the way that actually happens in physics than I am. But the point is just that, like, you could reasonably say something like, okay, just because I'm saying rejecting some aspect of this interpretation of the theory, that doesn't mean I'm rejecting the whole thing. I could still be a kind of structuralist about it and say, yeah, the broad, like the things about quantum field theory or whatever that are empirically verified, they're not going to go anywhere. It's like the interpretation that sits around it that we might be quibbling with. And it seems to me that it's more than just rejecting the core empirically grounded parts of science when we're talking about how to think about the implications of the fine-tuning argument. Really, if anything, what's going on seems to me as a non-physicist person is that if you be really simplistic about it, there's a kind of fallacy of like applying the results of a discipline beyond the range of that discipline. So something about physics, and now I'm saying something about metaphysics or like theology or whatever. And that's the move where I think you can reasonably object to that part of it without being some kind of huge revisionist about science in general. So I think that's where I would probably start to try and tease apart the aspects of this.
Right. So one thing I can just add in here, because we actually published our results of our survey now. We're doing a bigger one, which already has hundreds of replies. So we're going to have quite a large data set. But what we've got so far was from this Black Hole conference. And the view with the quote from the commenter was skeptical about the teleology of fine tuning. So presumably it means like there's a purpose behind it. So that's, overwhelmingly rejected by the physicists that we polled. That was the least popular result, had about 3%. So what was more popular? The most popular single answer was that the constants were brute facts that didn't require any sort of metaphysical explanation. Now, how you might justify that, I mean, I've interviewed a lot of these physicists who take this position, and they have various different ways to justify it, I think. Some doubt, not that the calculations are right. Sorry, they're not saying the calculations are wrong, but rather whether you can trust what they're doing. You're changing the constant nature. How do you know what other unseen effects might come around? We don't observe constants changing ever. So that could be one way you could do it. Others might say, look, I agree that, the universe would be very different. Maybe life wouldn't exist if these constants were different, but that doesn't mean you can imply that the probabilities for life are low, because, there's just knowledge that you don't have to give probabilities. Like, you don't have the causal history. You don't know what sets the constants. You just don't have enough knowledge to make the sort of probability argument. So another possibility, of course, was multiverse. That was the second most popular choice. Again, that doesn't require being anti-realists about fine-tuning. It's just another different solution. And then we had that the constants were necessary, and some physicists have argued, look, the constants, we never observe them changing. Everything else, the masses of stars and planets and people, these we observe can be different. We never observe the constant being different. Maybe they can't be different. Again, that I don't think that requires you to be an anti-realist about science. And then, of course, there's this Darwinian selection principle that Smolin's got a version of. Again, it's a speculative idea, but I don't think it requires anti-realism.
I think Smolin's idea is one that's helpful for thinking about the distinction that I raised between the two different senses of fine-tuning, right? So what Smolin points out is that, well, if you just had the one universe, then maybe we might think that some of these parameters that are important for life or for complex structure more generally are improbable values. But if you have the scenario that Smolin postulates, where universes give birth to other universes via black holes, and then the universes that are selected for are going to be those that produce the greatest number of black holes. Or to put that a different way, the universes that end up dominating the entire population of universes are those that have the maximum number of black holes. And then those Smolin are those that have the most amount of complex structure, right? Because it's complex structure that you need in order to generate black holes. Or so says Smolin. That's an attempt to make the value to construct a new theory where the values that these parameters have are more natural, more plausible, more probable, precisely because those are the values that dominate in the entire population of universes. So the challenge for the theist, I think, is to do something similar, is to say, actually, I have a theory that can replace current theories, and in which we have some non-ad hoc, well-justified reason for thinking that the universe would have these particular characteristics. Notice that would mean that they'd have to say something about God's motivations, right? They'd have to say that God would be motivated to create a universe that has those features, and that the justification they give for God having those motivations is not ad hoc, right? I mean, this non-ad hocness requirement is important because if it turned out that in all the different ways that you could have a deity, in some sense, most of them are ways in which deities wouldn't have those attributes, then the deity that you've come up with is fine-tuned. Or at least the theistic hypothesis then is fine-tuned, right? In the sense that the parameters, the free parameters that you put into the theory are not plausible or natural parameters for that theory. So yeah, I think that's precisely the work that the theist needs to do, and that, as far as I can tell, no theist has succeeded in doing. There are attempts to do that from philosophers of religion, though often in like online apologetic spaces, people don't even attempt to do something like that.
Right.
Just
Alex,
so Dan's just making me think then of it's an important point to bring out that like the way the fine-tuning argument is presented by people who present it well, like, and by that I mean people like Robin Collins or Luke Barnes. So
Right.
I basically mean not like Craig, basically, but like when you're putting it in these like Bayesian terms, it's important to recognize that what they're talking about is like epistemic probability. Like it's not supposed to be objective probability or something, right? Where it's not like, so for instance, that idea about like, well, maybe the laws of nature are just necessary or something. That's obviously a really interesting idea, but in a sense, if what you're talking about is a calculation of epistemic probability, just speculating that it's metaphysically necessary is orthogonal to that. It doesn't actually constitute like an objection or something, because there's lots. Then the point would just be, well, how many different ways can you imagine it being, or how many different ways are there consistent with what you believe that it could be necessary? It could be necessary in all of these different ranges or something. So they'll say it doesn't really help to say that maybe the laws of nature are necessary or something, but if we're doing that, if that's what we're doing, then I think that, just two quick points. Firstly, like what's epistemically necessary or epistemically possible, unlike a lethic possibility, which is just kind of metaphysical possibility or something, it's agent relative, right? Like what's epistemically possible to me might not be epistemically possible to you. Because like maybe, for me as a detective, it's epistemically possible that anybody in the room committed the murder. But you as the witness who watched Colonel Mustard killing Professor Plum or something, it's not really epistemically possible that anybody else did it, because you know who did it, right? So from your point of view, what's epistemically possible is way, way less broad than what it is for the detective who's coming into the room. So as a modality, just trivial statement about it, it's one of the agent relative modalities. Right, like what's conceivable or what's believable or what's imaginable, whatever. What's epistemically possible is agent specific, and so the whole calculation is a bit strange because, like, I mean, it just leads me into the second point, which is just like, from my point of view, it does really seem like I'm happy to say it's epistemically possible that God could be indifferent or evil or just wants black holes or just wants triangles or something. I don't know that he definitely wants there to be an interaction between moral agents and blah blah blah. Like that's a theological idea that I don't currently have in my constraining the range of epistemic possibilities for me. So I look at it and go, I guess, I'm an idiot when it comes to physics. So from my point of view, basically it's a big, massive range of things that could all be possible, epistemically speaking. But then also, because I'm not a religious person, I don't believe that there is a God of any type. If you're asking me to speak, well, what would it be like if God existed? Now, from my point of view, it's basically an equally large range. Because for me, if it's talking about epistemic possibility, I don't know, it could be anything, right? So that's where for me, the two things just sort of look quite similar. So, and I think like it's on the one hand, it's a nice technical maneuver to get away from these questions of like, well, what if the laws of nature are necessary? And you go, well, how? Well, we're not talking about that. We're talking about epistemic possibility. So that doesn't matter. But if we're talking about epistemic possibility, then this new issue comes in where I'm thinking, well, then it's agent relative. And if I'm thinking about what my epistemic possibilities are, then it's now these two pies look the same size. So it's going to be draw again.
Right. I mean, I guess we could add in like a certain type of Christian, like the conventional Christian, would want to say, oh, well, if there's a God, good God, it massively ups the probability of a life-permitting universe, But I could say, well, I'm a Gnostic and I think a good God wouldn't make the life-permitting universe because the physical universe is hell. And that's what traps souls in their bodies that can suffer. And so actually massively reduces, it does the opposite.
But the way you've stated it then was a conditional. Like, if there's a good God, then blah, blah, blah. I mean, okay, fine. I guess that's right. But then
there's only a good
there's
God,
a load of conditionals like that where you go like, if there's a universe that's disposed to make life, the conditions permissible for life, then it's really likely that there'd be life as well. Because if I just pack in the same stuff in the antecedent as you've got, but don't make it personal, going to have the same outputs. So I always find that part of it as well. It's like, we've talked about this before, I think. I maybe haven't even made the same point, but it's like unfairly stacking the deck. On the one hand, giving a really rich, detailed theistic hypothesis. God is good and he exists and he wants this to happen and he has the, blah, blah, blah. And on the other hand, naturalism is just like nothing. It's just like God doesn't exist and that's it. There's nothing else to say about it.
The next comment is from William Mackany, 1331. And I've slightly abridged it because it's quite long. But the quote is, Dr. Malpass may need to learn more about divine simplicity. This means there is no difference between God and his properties. If it's true, God's power, God's knowledge, and God's goodness stand for God. Although God has no parts, we must talk like he has them. If he had parts, we would need a cause to assemble them. So maybe that's why Aristotle says God is the uncaused cause. The word in can confuse because it suggests that God has parts. But Thomists say that in God there's something like what we call knowledge, something like what we call power, etc. They do that because we may think analogically about God. After all, he's vastly different from us. He goes on to say, some people ask what caused God if everything has a cause. But no classical theist says that everything has a cause. God's existence is inbuilt, so he doesn't derive it. That's why there's no vicious, infinite, regressive causes. When you ask why I believe in God but not other gods, you make a category error by lumping God together with other deities. The ancient Greek deities are creatures partly because they have natural parents, if those deities exist. That means you need to equivocate on God to talk about the biblical God and the pagan gods. Besides, you need to equivocate on God to talk about God and other deities. All right. So, Alex, this one is directed at you. What do you got to say for yourself?
I mean, there's about
Have you misunderstood divine simplicity?
I don't make any prior claim to having understood enough about what this commentator is asking. But there seems to be about 5 different points there. So it's hard to sort of go through all of it. He might be right that I need to learn more about divine simplicity. I'm happy to concede that. I don't know everything. And I learn new stuff about theology every day. So no doubt that's true. So he's saying it means there's no difference between God and his properties. Okay. I mean, I just think that a bit like the Trinity, it's just on my podcast, I was going through this presuppositionalist who was talking, and Van Tillian, and me and Dan have been reading this stuff about how the Trinity is supposed to solve the problem of the one and the many, and how obscure all of that really is, and how the hell it's supposed to work, and blah, blah, blah. And you just get this kind of like suspicion that what's going on is that like you go, here's a mystery and here's another mystery, and somehow that like cancels out. So now we don't have any mysteries, and that's like what's going on. And I just think like divine simplicity is just like it's more confusing than any of the things it tries to be a solution to. I just don't understand how God's power and his knowledge could be the same. Like, what are you talking about? What's going on? So this guy uses the standard sort of Thomistic idea that well, we're doing, if anyone talks like that, if anyone raises any kind of objection like that, they go, aha, you are talking univocally, and what you should be doing is talking analogically instead. Okay, it's fine. It's just that like when we've got an analogy, the difference between talking, directly or univocally about something and talking analogically about it is that like you're supposed to be able to say something like the actual nature of God is beyond my ken. I can't really talk exactly about what he's like. What I can do is give you an analogy. He's like this in this respect. So the way an analogy works is that you'll say something like he was like a volcano of anger or something. You're not actually saying he had lava coming out of his head. It's not supposed to be taken literally. What you're saying is that like the way that he, burst out with this tirade of shouting is in some sense similar to the way that the lava bursts out of the volcano. There's something about them. One of them's made of stone, the other one's made of flesh. They're not like each other in that respect, but they are like each other in this this other respect. So there's a difference and there's a similarity. That's how an analogy works. Otherwise, if there's no point of contact, it's just a different. It's just an irrelevant thing. Like if I say he was like a dog with anger or something, what do you mean? What's that got to do with it or whatever, right? So there has to be some overlap between the two things. And I just okay, great. Let's talk analogically. How is knowledge equal to power? Give me an analogy in which that's the case. And I sort of want to see what the thing in common is between the divine case and whatever's going to happen in this analogy. Otherwise, it's just like the appeal to analogical reasoning or something. It seems like they think that's enough. That's all you have to do. So you must be making the mistake that Thomas pointed out. Okay, great. So let's talk analogically then. Tell me the thing that they have in common. Give me the analogy and then tell me the thing they have in common. And then we can basically just chuck the rest of the analogy and just look at the thing that they have in common. Anyway, so that's what every time I hear Thomas talking about analogical reasoning, I always think that same thing there. The last bit, let's just talk a very little bit about the category mistake.
Oh, before we do that, hang on. There was the cause. God, if there's this issue of how do we get out of this infinite regressive causes? Do we need to get out of an infinite regressive causes? But it says, God's existence is inbuilt, so he doesn't derive it being a cause here. That's why there's no vicious infinite regressive causes. So what do we think of that?
Well, I mean, so he says some people ask what caused God if everything has a cause. Yeah, but like that's just like Dawkins level basic stuff, right? So nobody's saying that, so it's a complete straw man anyway. No classical theist says that everything has a cause. God's existence is inbuilt. So this is the interesting part of that, right? Which is that like there's a claim, and sometimes it's also about like explanatory regresses too, that God is self-causing, self-explanatory. Sometimes it's a self-authenticating, whatever. But in the same thing is dubious in each of these cases. It just doesn't seem like a type of relation that allows for, reflexive or circular relations between the things that it relates. So like it causes and their effects are distinct from each other. One and the same thing causing itself just sounds wrong. That's an aberration compared to all the other examples of causes that we have. Same sort of thing with explanations too. So like, okay, I mean, you could postulate it. So if you just say, despite there not being any real kind of experience that we can point to of there being self-causing things, sure, we could postulate it like Vilenkin does in that paper where he's talking about the origins of the universe. Whatever. The point is that anybody can postulate that type of thing. So if you just want to say, well, God is the self-causing thing, first of all, I'm going to say, that sounds really weird. But secondly, if I really wanted to just have a stalking horse hypothesis, well, I'll just construct the idea that something else is a self-causing thing. How come only God is allowed to have that property? I think that would be my question. It's not a category mistake. It's just that they're supposing that that nobody else can use their imagination to speculate that something might have a property that they say that God has. And it just seems, I don't know, kind of just like a blinkered way of looking at it. It's like assuming your interlocutor just can't do the move that you can do. We can all do that move. It's actually quite easy.
Dan, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like both of the places that Alex went in his response. The first one is a classic kind of response to the doctrine of to Thomas Aquinas' doctrine of analogy. I think it starts with, I think that this originates with Scotus, the idea that so Aquinas thinks that there's two possibilities. Either you predicate terms univocally of God or equivocally of God. If it's univocally of God, then it has the same meaning as it has of creatures. If it's equivocally of God, then it's a totally distinct meaning. Aquinas thinks that neither of those can be the way that language about God can work, and that what we need instead is something that strikes the balance between the two, which he calls analogy. Scotus comes along and says, that can't be. In order for there to be analogy, either it has to be that there's something in common between God and creatures that makes the analogy work, in which case it's not true that all terms have to be predicated of God analogically, or it's the case that all terms, that no terms are univocal between God and creatures, in which case analogy collapses into equivocity. And so either it collapses into one of the sides or the other that Aquinas wanted to avoid. The other place that Alex went there was about how so this business about whether God, whether the Christian God or maybe the Abrahamic God is uniquely the sort of deity that is being itself, and that no other deity could be like that. Well, take a look at like Spinoza's God, right? I mean, in some vague sense, Spinoza is a descendant of the Abrahamic tradition, but he certainly rejects a whole lot of that tradition and ends up being some kind of pantheist or something like this, maybe an atheist even. And on the Spinozistic position, it's the universe itself that is being itself. And so Spinoza makes precisely the same move as the Thomists on this point, but doesn't have the Thomistic God.
Right. I mean, some people accuse Spinoza of being an atheist, even though I don't think he liked the term, right?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, Spinoza, I don't think Spinoza thought of himself as an atheist, but regardless whether you think of him an atheist or not, his conception of God is so thoroughly divorced from a traditional Abrahamic conception that it's difficult to see him as like falling under that tradition, even if he kind of broke with it.
Yeah, I think that just to amplify the point a little bit, like there's this idea that there's like the reason that people in Spinoza's day were keen to label him as an atheist. Well, actually, presumably there was a lot of politics and sort of theological stuff that's actually going on in the background there. But the kind of conceptual background is the Christian conception of God is tied to a book, you know, where God is like characterized as doing certain things, having certain attitudes, being a certain way, or whatever. It's actually not that different from these Greek pantheon, whatever the guy wants to disparage. You know, he walks with Adam in the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis, right? He's there with feet walking and stuff. So it's not that different from the Greek conception of gods on Mount Olympus and whatnot. And he, you know, what does he do? He turns Sodom and Gomorrah into he smites them, and then
a pillar of salt. It turns him into a pillar of salt.
And then it's with Lot who turns around and he gets her for looking back.
Oh, sorry, yeah, Lot's wife gets that.
Yeah, right. Anyway, stuff like that, where it's just like it seems like a specific decision he's made in response to some particular coming and going in the causal order that's happened. So he's like interacting with the causal order like that. So you've got this, like, on the one hand, kind of personal, historical, like normal, primitive kind of conception of like the big boss man in the sky, whatever. And then there's thousands of years of like theologians and philosophers going, oh, what about simplicity and aseity and blah, blah, blah. And they pin all these philosophical concepts on a sort of shell that really could have just been anything. Like if if Justin the Apostate had not died in when he was invading Persia on a foolish errand, like because Constantine's son dies and Julian's the only living, and he was a pagan. He was like studied in the academy in Athens, or whatever. And it was a bit where he was the emperor, and the whole history of the Roman Empire could have gone differently. And like, imagine he did, and the empire gets rid of Christianity, goes back to paganism again, and then hundreds and hundreds of years later, Thomas Aquinas comes on, and he's like, "Oh, I know. Let's come up with this 5 ways of proving that Zeus exists." And he could have just penned all of the same philosophical concepts and just gone, yeah, forget about those stories where he's like walking and talking. Let's think about him in a much more abstract sense and blah, blah. And you just still had the God of the philosophers, is my point. And that could have just come out of any religious tradition. It's got really nothing to do with what seemingly contingent historical artifacts of the specific stories that we've got in that religious tradition. So I just think that it's not a category mistake. In fact, if there's a category mistake, it's in assuming kind of essentiality of this character in this book having these philosophical concepts. Like, you could pin those philosophical concepts on anything. And sometimes when a naturalist tries to say, oh, maybe the universe has got aseity or something, the Christian just doesn't understand that that's almost like a reductive, it's like a parody. But the point that they're trying to point out, it seems to me, is what I was just saying then, that these philosophical concepts got nothing to do with the historical story of the Bible. And you could just attribute them just as effectively arbitrarily onto anything if you want to do, onto Zeus, onto Thor, whatever, onto some god that you've just made up. So yeah, I guess that's my other beef with that whole thing.
Yeah, I can imagine, if that had happened, that the pagans had sort of conquered Europe and Persia and so on, you would have the sort of apologists saying, yeah, those stories about Zeus, they're allegorical, they're not to be taken literally.
Exactly.
But it's the essential truth of blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And yeah, okay, Zeus had a parent, that's true. But there were, the primordial gods. I know Erebus quite well because my cat's named after him. So there were primordial gods. And then before them, I suppose it's supposed to be sort of chaos. But you could say in the Bible, there was a primordial chaos and then God creates from that.
Suppose that, the group that Akhenaten formed in ancient Egypt, that Akhenaten's thing didn't die out. It would be very easy to take the classical theistic conception of God and instead put that on Aten.
Yeah.
And, as far as the ancient Greek gods go, if you read about the way that some of the ancient Greeks, or Romans for that matter, talked about the gods, you do sometimes get some very sophisticated philosophical conceptions, right? So if you read Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, this isn't a book where we're being presented with a Homeric conception. So I think that's really important, that we don't just think of the ancients as having Homeric conceptions. There were people who had broader, different, more philosophical conceptions that.
Oh, Dan, can you explain what you mean by a Homeric conception? I'm sure everyone will.
Yeah. So Homer was an ancient Greek poet who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. These are two epics that, the stories that are told in those two epics involve various details about the gods, and the gods are portrayed as really, is really a lot like human beings in various respects. There's quarrels among the gods, for example. The gods are far less than perfect, and it's one of the sources that we have for knowing about ancient Greek mythology. There are other similar sources as well, but the point here is just that that's not the be all and end all of ancient Greek religion. There were other conceptions of either god or gods among the ancient Greeks, some of which are quite philosophically sophisticated.
Right. Okay. Right. So let's move on to the next comment here. So this one's addressed to you, Dan, and it's from Philo New. And the context of this quote was when we were talking about moral philosophy, metaethics, and Dan had said that, a lot of the arguments we hear from Christian apologists that you can't get objective morality without God just sort of ignores 2,400 years of moral philosophy where they've tried to do exactly that sort of thing. So the quote is here: "You observe that people like Craig seem to be ignorant of 2,400 years of history of moral philosophy. Your point is that many of the great philosophers in history have formulated moral theories according to which morality is objective, but they have nothing to do with God. First of all, one of those philosophers you mentioned is Plato. I don't think Plato is the best example to support your point. For Plato, God is the good, a transcendent being and locus of morality. Perhaps you should have mentioned Kant, whose theory does not rely on God as the paradigm of moral values and duties. Second, even if you take Kant's moral theory as an example of a godless moral theory, what does the existence of moral theories that do not rely on the existence of God prove? In your view, it proves that morality is objective without God. If this is your argument, it is not successful for the reason that regardless of how good a godless morality is, A, it does nothing to do away with God, and B, no theory of morality is self-sufficient. Deontological theories presuppose the objectivity of values or duties, as in the case of Kant's theories, presuppose the inherent value of rational beings. Teleological theories do not presuppose the objectivity of value and duties, however, they presuppose the objective value of pleasure, happiness, satisfaction, and preference. The bottom line is that you cannot do away with the moral argument by simply invoking normative theories. Just like the theory of evolution tells you a lot about evolution of natural organisms, but says nothing about the origin of life itself. Normative theories can tell you a great deal about how to determine right from wrong, but say nothing about right and wrong itself. All right, Dan, what have you got to say for yourself?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of points here. Let's go through each of them one at a time. So they say that Plato is a bad example because for Plato, God is the good. Well, I don't think this is a very plausible interpretation of Plato. I've spoken to Plato scholars, and they don't seem to think that this is a good interpretation of Plato either. There's perhaps what they have in mind is that the form of the good plays a role in Plato's metaphysics, at least the metaphysics often attributed to Plato, that resembles the role that God plays in, say, Christian theology. But that's not to say that Plato thinks that the good is God or a God. So Plato thinks that the form of the good is the highest of all the forms. All the other forms somehow depend upon the good, and various other aspects of the world, since they depend on the forms, depend upon the form of the good. But Plato didn't think that the good is an entity with a mind or a will. The good is not what created the universe, or the physical universe for Plato. He doesn't refer to the good in the way that he refers to various deities. There's no conflict. There's no inherent conflict between atheism and the view that there is some impersonal entity, like the form of the good, upon which everything else depends. That's maybe not a position that many online atheists nowadays defend, but it's one that an atheist certainly could defend. And I think actually in the philosophical community, some version of Platonism or some view that descends from Plato is actually really common among atheists. Now, there is a deity that Plato thinks, or at least, well, it's hard to know what exactly it is that Plato thought on any particular thing because he wrote in dialogues where you have people who are arguing about issues. But there's a dialogue called the Timaeus in which this myth is given about the creation of the universe, where there's a being called the demiurge, who we might think of as being kind of like a god, that fashions the physical universe out of some pre-existing chaos, and does so in imitation of the forms that have this prior or more perfect existence. The That's the thing that, in various respects, is the closest that you come to a god in Plato's view, but it's it's similar to a Christian view in that the demiurge creates the physical universe and that the demiurge fashions the physical universe and designs the whole thing and has a mind and so on. It's different from the Christian conception in that the demiurge isn't perfect or it's not perfectly good, and can only create an imperfect creation, can't create a perfect creation. So I don't think that Plato is actually a bad example. Their second point was they said, even if you take Kant's moral theory as an example of a godless moral theory, what does the existence of moral theories that do not rely on the existence of God prove? And then they say, in your view, it proves that morality is objective without God? ? Well, no, I don't think that the mere existence of a God-independent theory proves that morality would be objective without God. It could still be that morality is subjective, but Craig is the one who thinks two things. He thinks that, on the one hand, we have excellent reason to think that there are objective moral truths. We have reason to think that from our moral intuition. And then he also thinks that the only possible explanation is some sort of theistic explanation. Well, in order to establish that conclusion, what Craig needs to do is he needs to show that all of those God-independent moral theories fail. What I'm merely doing is pointing out that we have a whole zoo of God-independent theories. There are, by the way, also God-independent theories that no one has thought of yet. He'd also have to rule out those, which is difficult. I'm not sure how he would actually do that, but at least that's what he would need to do to establish his conclusion. Now, the viewer, the comment also said something about whether this would mean that God doesn't exist. Like if you had a God-independent moral theory, whether that would show something about God's not existing. Well, of course not. Like if you had a God-independent theory and it turned out to be the right theory of morality, that in itself wouldn't tell us whether or not God exists, because it's a God-independent theory, right? It's a theory that atheists could accept, but equally so it's a theory that theists could accept.
There are theists who would say there's subjective morality, but it doesn't come from God, right?
That's right. So Richard Swinburne thinks exactly, and I think it's the position that the theists ought to take, because I don't understand the idea that you can ground a property, in this case a moral property like goodness, in a concrete particular like God, or any other concrete particular for that matter, right? This is also why I don't think I don't see a way to defend a meta-ethical view where morality is grounded in human beings either, but for precisely the same reason. Human beings are concrete particulars. They also are not the right sorts of things to ground properties, in this case the moral property of goodness. Now, the comment said that for someone like Kant, they simply assume the existence of moral values without giving an account of how they exist. I'm not actually sure that that's true about Kant. It seems to me that Kant wants to ground morality in considerations about rationality or something like this. But I'm not a Kant scholar, and so people who maybe know more about Kant could fill in more of the Kantian picture. I think, though, that there's an important distinction that doesn't come across in what the commenter is saying, and that's that there's a well-recognized distinction between what are called normative ethical theories and meta-ethical theories. So normative ethical theories give us an account of what the distinction might be between, say, right and wrong action. Maybe right actions are the sort of actions that bring about the greatest good for the greatest number of people. That would be a kind of consequentialism. Imagine other kinds of consequentialism. Meta-ethical theories, on the other hand, are supposed to give us an account of what's called moral ontology. They're supposed to tell us about how there could be these moral properties in the first place. Now, what we shouldn't do is make the mistake that we have to be some sort of reductionist about ethics. So there are some people who think that moral properties can be reduced to some other kind of property. So if you're a divine command theorist, you might think something like this. You might think that moral properties can be reduced to some sort of characteristics that God has, that moral properties like goodness are not explanatory rock bottom. There's some layer of explanation underneath them. There are also naturalists who think something like that. Who think that the natural world somehow provides an explanation underwrites the level of moral explanation. But you don't have to think that. You could think that moral properties themselves are irreducible. Someone like G.E. Moore or Plato thinks something like that. And in fact, there is a tradition in theology that says something similar about God. If you buy into both that God's nature grounds goodness, or that and you buy into divine simplicity. So in other words, you buy into the idea that God's nature is the good. Then what you have to say is that since God doesn't, there's nothing like more fundamental that grounds God. There's then nothing more fundamental that grounds the good. And so in that sense, the theist who buys into simplicity has to say that there's that goodness actually doesn't have some further explanation beyond goodness itself. So in that sense, the theist too has to simply in some way assume that goodness exists without something further that underwrites it, precisely because for that kind of theist, they want to say that there's nothing more fundamental than God that underwrites God. So, yeah, and let's see. Was there a third part of the?
I think that probably gets to the argument. Let me throw it over to Alex. Thoughts on this comment?
Well, I think Dan was quite thorough then. Just to maybe amplify the last point a bit, where they were saying, I've got it up here. The bottom line is that you cannot do away with the moral argument simply by invoking normative theories. So by normative theories, I don't know that they are trying to make the distinction between like a normative ethics and a meta ethics. I don't know. I think they just mean moral theory in general.
I think that's what they meant. Yeah, from the context, that's what they meant. Yeah.
But then they just fall into, like, because they're not distinguishing those two concepts, they say, just like the theory of evolution tells you a lot about the evolution of natural organisms, but says nothing about the origin of life itself. Normative theories, as in just moral theories generically, can tell you a great deal about how to determine right from wrong, but say nothing about right and wrong itself. But like that just is the distinction between a normative theory and a meta-ethical theory. So like, okay, maybe consequentialism doesn't tell you anything about the nature of values, but meta-ethics does. And so it's not much of a gotcha to point that out, because like, that's, we've thought of that. Not we've thought of that, but like philosophy in general already has gone over that. It's common parlance. So it felt like he was trying to declare victory, but it didn't seem to me like there was much of a victory to be celebrated there. It was a bit premature.
Yeah, I mean, let's try and be a little bit charitable to the commenter. I mean, I think when they said normative to making, I think that was maybe a mistake. Maybe what they meant to say was appealing to these atheistic, non-God theories. They can't bottom out at something fundamental.
Well, I think
maybe that's what they were trying to say.
I think what they meant was, I think they were using their phrase normative theory as a general term for moral theories. I think all of that is, but I think that the reason I brought up the distinction between normative ethics and meta-ethics is not because they mentioned the phrase normative theory at that particular point, but rather because the distinction that they're drawing between theories that tell you like which things are right or like how to find this or whatever, and then theories that tell you about moral ontology, that just is the distinction between what's normally called normative theory and meta-ethical theory. And then it seems like they're only really aware of normative theories like Kantian ethics, and they're not aware that there's this other family of theories, meta-ethical theories, that try to do this other job. They say secular theories don't do well. In fact, there's a whole zoo of theories that do precisely that. Now, by the way, I think if you go back in the history of this topic, before people were drawing the distinction between meta-ethics and normative ethics, there were people who were presenting what we now call normative theories, but were in some way gesturing towards meta-ethical theories. So, for instance, Mill seems to have thought that the uh, the goodness of pleasure is grounded or explained by the nature of pleasure itself. That pleasure is somehow intrinsically desirable, and that pain is somehow intrinsically undesirable. And it's those intrinsic features of pleasure and pain that make one good to bring about and the other bad to bring about. So I think, even in the historical normative ethical literature, you can find people that are maybe giving embryonic meta-ethical accounts. But over the course of the 20th century, people began to give really sophisticated meta-ethical accounts. And if someone goes out in literature today, that's what they can find if they look at meta-ethics.
I think that's probably fair to say about Kant as well. Like, it's not clear to me anyway, and like, just like you, I'm not a Kant scholar, so maybe I'm getting this bit wrong, but if you think about what Kant says about the categorical imperative or whatever, that, you should only will that which you could imagine being a universal maxim or whatever. Is that a question about moral ontology or a question about moral epistemology? Like, is that supposed to be a normative ethic? At least it is definitely a normative ethic. It's like one of the two paradigm examples of normative ethic. Is it also supposed to be a claim about meta-ethics as well? And that's what the nature of moral obligations is or something. I mean, because maybe it's just not clearly distinguished in his day. It wasn't clearly distinguished in his day, so maybe he's making a blunder or something. I don't know. But just for the sake of, because it's a comment where they were trying to score a ponage point, and they were like, well, Plato's not a good example. Maybe Kant's a better example. Well, Kant's a better example if you have normative ethics in mind, but it's like not clear that he's making a meta, like, or to what extent it's supposed to be taken as a meta-ethical example. So given that meta-ethics is what's relevant, it's not clear that Kant is actually a good example anyway. Maybe a worse example than Plato, in fact, because what he's doing is merely giving a normative ethics. I don't know. So that's a footnote, really. It doesn't even matter. I mean, I don't mind if you don't even include this comment in the video edit, Phil, when you do it. But it just struck me as like a kind of a funny point that, there's some way you could argue that, like, actually Plato's a better example than Kant, given that.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think Plato gives a kind of, maybe one of the first meta-ethical accounts in history, right, is Plato's.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to move it on to the last comment. This was from our show when we were commenting on Frank Turek. And this is from L5 Player, who says, the last laugh is on you guys, not Dr. Turek. You can propose anything you want and believe what you will. But ultimately, if your non-theistic worldview is right, then whatever you believe is true is meaningless, because the minds you're using to arrive at that conclusion would just be tissue, nerves carrying electrical signals and blood, much like your kidneys, heart, and spleen. Only somehow, this particular array of body parts inside your skull produce things like thoughts, dreams, emotions, memories, intuition, and the ability to mock people like Turek and feel superior. What significance, what meaning, what purpose, what weight does that carry? None. Your brains are just the product of random mutations, biological processes, and chemistry. Why should their end product, namely your thoughts and rationales, mean anything or prove anything? Ultimately, your very existence carries no purpose or destiny or reason. It just is. You may as well assign significance to a mud splatter on a wall. Does it mean anything? No. It's without purpose, meaning, or destiny. It fits with nothing. It just is. If you're happy with that, then have at it. Alex, how should we reply to this?
Well, I could just say I am happy with that, so fine. See you later.
All right, great.
No, but so this is gesturing towards sort of family of arguments that's quite familiar. So many people watching this will have come across this is a argument from reason. It must go back earlier than this, but it's associated with C.S. Lewis, who was a Christian apologist, and loads of people still love him a lot. And he has a paper where he writes an argument that's very similar to that, which is basically like, if determinism is true, right, then, your brain is just, there's like no choice internally that you're in control of about what conclusions you come to when you're thinking about stuff. Like, so your reasoning is just sort of out of your control. You just reason the way you have to reason because of the stimuluses or whatever stimuli that antecedent to your reasoning about stuff. And just like if somebody, puts a gun to your head and forces you to withdraw all the money from your bank account or something, you're not really responsible for that action because you're being coerced in that course of events, right? And the same sort of thing is supposed to be true if you're thinking, well, I'm just being caused by these chemical reactions in my brain or something, then I'm not really responsible for the reasons that I come to or the reasoning that I go through. And so rationality seems to be impossible if determinism is true. But, again, fallacy of the atheist must be a determinist and a materialist, etc., etc. But even if, it seems to me that even if you grant that the atheist has to buy all of those premises about materialism and determinism and stuff, I just think the conclusion doesn't follow anyway. And it's interesting that there was a reply to this by a Christian philosopher, Peter van Inwagen, arguably the greatest Christian philosopher currently working in the field, who I think is also a materialist. He has a non-standard set of metaphysical views anyway, but regardless of what his views were, a simple line of argument is something like that there's this kind of fallacy, trying to be quick about this rather than going into like sort of neurotic detail about it, but like this fallacy of like you being caused and being coerced, not quite the same thing. And when it comes to like these, whether or not the thought process you go through is rational or not, is more about what the connections are between the ideas that you have. Whether, specifically, paradigmatically or something, it would be like if you're clear enough of mind to think through a syllogism and you're thinking, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. In a way, it doesn't really matter if you're caused to think that. It's still true that those premises do, in fact, lead to conclusions. So, like, it passes the rationality test, and it's kind of spurious to imagine that, in addition to the premises, in fact, entailing the conclusion, in addition to that, it has to be that you freely assent to the conclusion. Like, what difference does that make? Why does it help if I'm free to sort of go, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is not mortal? Like, I have that freedom, but that's not a good thing, and it doesn't make it better just because I could have said that I in fact agree that Socrates is mortal or something. So it just seems like it's an irrelevant condition that's added in, like being rational means X, Y, and Z, and also that the conclusions are arrived at through a process of basically libertarian free will. Like, that just seems an addition that nobody actually asked for and nobody was expecting. And yet the argument from reason insists that that's a condition for rationality. And I guess the whole point is that, like, what seems like a good argument when you're putting it like this, it's, what does he say? Things like these product of random mutations, biological processes. This kind of, the rhetoric sounds good. But when you really do go into the fine print and start looking at what's at stake, when you really look at the argument, it's a question of like, is libertarian free will a criteria of rationality or not? And that's just, it's not clear that it is. If you have an argument that it is, it's quite subtle, and it's going to involve a lot more than just sort of referencing vaguely towards determinism or something. It's like, why think that? And I get you very, very, very quickly. Just doesn't it seem like this doesn't settle it? But the starter for 10, the kind of intuition that maybe you latch onto is that, like, something like a computer or at least a calculator or something, if I type in 9 times 9 or whatever, and then it tells me what the answer is, sure, that just went through a series of mechanical steps or something, but the answer's true, like, and it arrived at it through essentially a rational process because it's codified in order to arrive at the right arithmetical conclusions, right? That's all that counts. for rationality in that context. So if it's getting the answer right, that's all that matters. Whether it's free to pick a different option doesn't seem to matter at all, and it's not clear why, free calculator that could sometimes choose to say, oh, actually it is, 13 or whatever. Why would that be better or more rational just because it had that ability? So I think if you find that intuition plausible, then that's a sort of like direction where you can push back against this whole argument from reason thing. I mean, we should probably do a whole episode on that one day, but I mean, that's my thumbnail sketch of what's wrong with that.
Yeah. Dan, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so we can pick out like a broader range of characteristics that human beings we typically think of them having. So, for instance, there's moral significance. Normally, we think of human beings as having moral significance, as being rational creatures, as being creatures that are both meaningful in the moral sense, like they have meaningful lives, and in the semantic sense, in that they can string together meaningful sentences. And the claim here is supposed to be that if human beings were material entities of some kind, then they wouldn't have those features. But if they were immaterial souls, as Christians at least typically claim, then they would have those features. But that, of course, is precisely what hasn't been shown, right? And just as they are going to, just as this commenter could say without motivation, that no material system could have those characteristics, so too someone could make the claim that no soul or no immaterial entity could have those characteristics. Right? I mean, it's an assertion either way, and so it's unclear what difference an immaterial soul would make. Now, it's also unclear why this has anything to do with God. So suppose that it were true that human beings couldn't have those characteristics unless they were immaterial, or had an immaterial component, and suppose that we know that we do have those characteristics. Well, then what you could do is you could rule out that we're material entities, or at least wholly material entities, but you couldn't rule in that there's another immaterial entity, namely God. I mean, maybe what this comes down to is some kind of design argument where they say, oh, if it weren't for God, then to design us as having those characteristics, then we couldn't have them. But now I don't understand what it matters whether we are material. Why couldn't God design a material system that had those features? Presumably that just is Van Inwagen's view, or the view of Christian materialists.
Yeah.
And it's also the view of Charles Darwin's grandfather, I think, this late 18th century figure.
Erasmus Darwin.
That's right, Erasmus Darwin, who also was a kind of Christian materialist. And it's, if you go all the way back to the 17th century, you can find someone like John Locke bringing up this kind of point. So Locke had this question about whether or not we were just material entities that had these characteristics super added to them by God, or if we are immaterial souls. And Locke thinks that there's really no way for us to answer that kind of question. I think it comes down to precisely this, that what's being claimed here is just that one entity doesn't have these characteristics, another does. And while that might be intuitive for some people, it's certainly not something that's been established.
Right. Can I just one last thing on this is one interpretation of this question is that it goes back to the argument from reason, but another interpretation of it is that it's more to do with not so much like epistemology, but questions about like existential significance or whatever. Like, how can your life?
Yeah, that's how I interpreted it. Actually, yeah.
So on that view, then, and I think some of the things that support that is because it's quite it's not very specific, some of the way that he's putting things, but he says your brains are just the product of random mutations. I mean, that's the thing that makes me think of that argument from reason. Biological process and chemistry. Why should their end product, namely your thoughts and rationales, mean anything or prove anything? Ultimately, and here is the point, your very existence carries no purpose or destiny or reason. And now that sounds like the existential worry that, like, well, it's, you know, life in a godless world is sort of like, it's like Camus or something. It's like an absurd thing with no deeper significance or something, right? So then what's helpful about this, there's a really great debate between William Lane Craig and Shelley Kagan. Anyway,
I think it's Kagan, yeah.
Yeah, there's a bit.
Oh, no, actually, is it? Oh, no, I'm not sure myself.
Yeah, okay, Kagan, I think so. And there's a bit there where Craig says something like, well, you know, if everything's going to end in the heat death of the universe or something, then, you know, your actions carry no significance. It really doesn't matter if you're charitable or miserly or whatever, right? Like, it's all going to end the same way. And Kagan kicks back at that, saying, like, I don't know why that matters. And, you know, let's say that's like significant sort of metaphysical meaning or something. But, like, maybe the atheist just doesn't think that sort of thing is real. But it's like some kind of like scope distinction thing to just say, well, there's no ultimate meaning, therefore there's no meaning in any sense. Well, that feels wrong, right? Because, I mean, sure, maybe there's no cosmic weighing scales at the end of everything where someone says, oh, you were a good boy or you were naughty or something, and that question isn't like given once and for all at the end of eternity or something. But that doesn't matter. The point is that, like, your actions have meaning and significance right now. Like, if you're mean to someone, it's the consequences, the actual meanness of it and the impact that it has on that person right now. That's where the meaning is to be found. And, like, saying, well, there's no, like, mystery meaning off there in the distance. Like, atheists go, yeah, sure, there isn't a mystery meaning. You just made that up. I don't even believe in that. But they're not going to concede that just because that sense of cosmic destiny or whatever isn't real, that then there's nothing you can say whatsoever. I mean, you know, this is a little bit, just because I've been thinking about this other topic recently. There's this idea in Aristotle that he seems to, like, say, when he's arguing for the law of non-contradiction, he argues against the idea that all contradictions are true. And this picks a problem with that, and then says that must mean no contradictions are true. And it's like a scope distinction. Same sort of thing here. If it's like, if you reject ultimate meaning, you must reject local meaning as well. And I think that's partly what's, I think, informing this here. If there's no destiny, I mean, sure, there's no destiny. That doesn't mean it's like no difference whether I steal from your wallet or buy you a pint or something. They're completely different, even if we all die in the heat death of the universe, right?
Right. I think the example Shelley Kagan gave was like someone being tortured. And Craig was like, well, what does it matter? You know, they're all going to die in the heat death of the universe anyway. And he goes, surely it matters to the victim of the torture that they're being tortured.
Exactly.
Like, it doesn't have to matter, like, you know, 100 trillion years from now. It's like, okay, if there's anyone there, no one's going to care. But it matters at that point. And I think what gives it significance is that there's a sentient being and something's happening to that sentient. Now, whether that sentience arrives from a complex process of the brain, and, you know, it's some kind of emergent property or some other means, I don't know why it matters. Like, surely.
If you do think that kind of cosmic significance matters, just because something is temporary in the sense that it has some finite duration of time over which it lasts, that doesn't mean that it's not eternal in another sense, right? So in the philosophy of time, one view that you could have is that there's an eternal space-time block. And the fact that someone suffered at some time is a part of the space-time block that doesn't pass away. Like, the space-time block is just there. In the literature in the theological literature, some people have taken this up as a reason not to be like a B theorist, for instance, not to subscribe to the space-time block, because if there is a space-time block, it means that the suffering in the world is never overcome by Christ. It's an argument that Ryan Mullins makes. But of course, if you are an atheist that believes in the space-time block, then you can say, yeah, that suffering is a permanent part of the world in some sense. I mean, in fact, there's an episode towards the end of Einstein's life where he's trying to console through a letter the widow of a friend of his, and he says, "Look, our our friend might not be at this time with us, but they're still out there in some sense because the space-time block never goes away. In that sense, our friend is eternal. And so, if you want eternal significance, well, there's a way you can have it on an atheistic picture.
I remember Craig actually mocking that letter, saying that would never console anyone. And you know what? Craig might be right. Maybe it wouldn't, but maybe because they don't. It's not part of their, belief system, like entrenched in them since they were a child. But if it was, maybe it would.
Well, it might not be consoling, but whether or not it's consoling is like a different issue, right? So the issue here is whether or not there's cosmic significance under atheism, and by cosmic significance, we mean some part of the world that doesn't pass away. Well, the space-time block has some particular feature, is an aspect of the world that on a particular ontology of time doesn't pass away. And whether we find that consoling or not is a different story. Maybe what that tells us is that cosmic significance is not the kind of thing that's consoling. And I kind of, if someone said to me, hey, look, what you do now matters for the heat death of the universe, I don't know why I should care about that. Like, that's not the kind of thing that motivates me anyway. So yeah.
But Alex, you're going to say something, and then we're going to wrap up.
So Nietzsche is this like late 19th century philosopher, obviously firebrand, kind of God is dead guy, and he has this idea that he thinks is super profound. Sort of last phase of his work, which is called the eternal recurrence, right? Where it's him struggling with these ideas of like cosmic significance and meaning, and he's trying to wonder, well, what would it be like if we had a system of values or whatever that wasn't the Christian one? We were just imagining a new mythology or a new kind of axiology or whatever. And he thinks that his best idea, his best suggestion, is to imagine the world as being a cycle where everything plays out over and over again in exactly the same way. And there's a bit where he sort of talks about the psychological effects of believing that was the case, where he thinks that it sort of meets all these criteria that you'd want for a sort of mythological basis for a value system, because like it means that the most trivial thing that you're doing, like having a cup of tea or just having a chat with your friend or something, is something where you should really be prepared. It's almost like Kant with the shouldn't do something unless you could will it to be a universal maxim. Is here he's like, it's Nietzsche saying you shouldn't really do anything unless you'd be like comfortable with that being repeated for an infinite number of times forever. But it's quite similar to what Dan was just saying then, which is like, imagine just the B theory version of this. It's not eternally recurring. It's just that like if you do something, it's like stepping in wet cement, where like it's just going to be there forever after that point. And like, don't draw like a dick in the wet cement unless you're happy for everyone to see that you did that forever. It's going to be, there's nothing you can do so you should like take it on board, and like having that sense of permanence or something. If that's the thing you need to make you kind of act responsibly and do the right thing or something, if that's cosmic significance, blah, blah, blah. I do think there are like, ways, like Dan was saying, is this thinking about the B theory or eternal recurrence or something could be a completely godless way of imagining that your actions have cosmic significance if you really want to. So yeah.
Well, I'll actually, just to close off, I'm going to bring it back to the book, Battle of the Big Bang, because we have a model that actually realizes Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. It's we consider all kinds of models for the Big Bang. And one of them, actually, it's the very last one we consider. It's called periodic time cosmology. And it actually realizes eternal recurrence. And you might think, God, this is so speculative. And it is speculative. But there's a reason to take it seriously, because it gives you a way to actually get the scale invariance in the cosmic microwave background. And there's a very neat mechanism where if you have this sort of loop in time, where it just you will actually get the scale invariant feature in the cosmic microwave background. So maybe it's not so speculative, and maybe that is an atheist way to give you cosmic significance if you want it. But we're going to leave it there. If you like this content, please give us a like, subscribe to the channel, give us your thoughts in the comments and any suggestions for future shows, and we will see you next time on the Sci Fi Show.